Hello, my friends. Welcome to a video on neurotransmitters and the receptors of the autonomic nervous system. We're going to take a look at some of these terms we've been throwing around. I think we've just hinted at cholinergic, and then we'll throw in nicotinic. You may have seen it. If you've seen it and wondered what it is, now you'll know. Muscarinic and adrenergic. Those are the four things we're really after. And how will we test ourselves when we're done? We'll take these three, muscarinic and nicotinic, which are the two types of cholinergic receptors, and then adrenergic receptor, and we'll match them up with these, what is that, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things on the right hand side. And we'll just do a quick match, and we'll learn about the difference between muscarinic and nicotinic, or the cholinergic receptors, and adrenergic receptors. And that's what we will do to test ourselves. And probably the hardest thing to get your head around with this video is kind of just one thing I think that can be a little complex, is to really separate in your mind whether we're talking about the neuron or the receptors. The neuron itself would be sort of preganglionic or presynaptic, if you will. Either one works. And then the receptors would be postganglionic or postsynaptic. So in this image, before I get into all the details, separate out the neuron. This is a cholinergic neuron that I just circled because it's releasing acetylcholine, right? This is a cholinergic neuron. And remember, these are all, both of those I just circled, and I'll do the red one down here. These are all cholinergic neurons because they're releasing acetylcholine. And these, again, are presynaptic. That's something we learned from before. Now we can also call them preganglionic because they're sort of headed into a ganglion here. So we describe the neurons as being cholinergic, mostly, because they mostly release acetylcholine at the synapse. Okay. Then separate that from the receptor. The receptors are on the postganglionic or the postsynaptic. Okay. So the receptors we're talking about are on this neuron. The receptors are on the postganglionic, or they're on the postsynaptic neuron, or the receptors are on the effector itself. So the actual sweat gland, the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, all the things that could react under the autonomous, the effectors, the things that do the work. So just separate on your mind the neuron, and it being mostly cholinergic and releasing, or adrenergic neuron, and the receptor. Okay, so just trying to get that across and get that sort of subtlety across to you. Anyway. The cholinergic neurons are the ones that I just checked off. All these are cholinergic neurons because they release acetylcholine. Okay? And you can see all these are releasing acetylcholine here. All releasing acetylcholine. All right. This one is not because it's releasing norepinephrine. So this is an adrenergic neuron as well as adrenergic receptors too. But cholinergic neurons, they make up all of the presynaptic or the preganglionic neurons in the entire ANS, both in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, down here in C. And they make up also the postganglionic or the postsynaptic neurons of the entire PNS. This is all the parasympathetic down here. So the entire parasympathetic, plus just the sweat glands in the sympathetic. Right? So that's where the cholinergic neurons come in. Okay? But again, really taking a look at the receptors now. So great, okay, great. A neuron is cholinergic. It releases acetylcholine. Great. But what are these other words that are sitting right here? What does nicotinic mean? Why are these nicotinic, and these that I'm outlining now are muscarinic? What does that mean? It means that even though acetylcholine is released at all 5 of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, acetylcholine is released by the neuron in all 5 of these, but the receptor on the postsynaptic side could be nicotinic receptor or it could be a muscarinic receptor. Those are the two types. They both respond to acetylcholine. They just do so differently, and that's how we call them, nicotinic or muscarinic. And this is this point I'm trying to make, that the receptor is half the game. So don't get too enamored with the actual neurotransmitter. Sure, that's really important to know what neurotransmitter is released at the synaptic cleft. But be sure you understand what receptor is there too. Right? And so the first of the two, there were two, nicotinic and muscarinic. Let's tackle the nicotinic. All right, and the nicotinic are going to be found in the postsynaptic or the postganglionic neurons of everything in the ANS. So every single one of these neurons and the dendrites in the cell bodies, or on the receiving end, if you will, and all these post-ganglionic neurons are all going to have nicotinic receptors, right? They're all going to have nicotinic receptors. And remember, we also find them at the NMJ too, right? The neuromuscular junction. That's receiving the acetylcholine from an alpha motor neuron, and inside that synaptic cleft, and on the muscle cell itself, on the membrane of the muscle cell that receives the acetylcholine. We talked about this step over and over again in 40A, but we never, I don't think, specifically mentioned that these were nicotinic receptors that were receiving the acetylcholine on the muscle membrane, on the skeletal muscle membrane. But now you know, and pretty much the entire first step from that preganglionic neuron to the postganglionic neuron is all done with nicotinic receptors, right? Nicotinic receptors. And they are always, and this is very big, if something you're going to, in neurobiology, you're always going to want to be able to understand what this is. I'm showing stimulation right here with the plus. And the point to this is that these nicotinic receptors are always depolarizing. They're always creating EPSPs, excitatory postsynaptic potentials. They're always exciting, right? And they're always continuing signal down the line wherever it may go. You'll see when we head to the actual receptor, it's not always excitatory. There can be inhibitory effects on the effectors, right? You know that. You, in the autonomic system, you shut things off and you turn them on depending on whether you're under sympathetic or parasympathetic. So at the effector level, way down the line at the very end, we may need to shut some things off. You might need to shut off your parotid and your salivary glands when you're being chased by a bear, and then turn them back on when you're safe and you can start digesting and metabolizing again. But just know that this first step, the first steps from sort of that preganglionic on through, is always excitatory because it's always nicotinic. And nicotinic receptors are always depolarizing and creating EPSPs. And why are they called nicotinic? Because nicotine, active chemical in tobacco, is a tremendous agonist or a mimic, right, at these receptors. And so nicotine in your body just fires up and it binds into nicotinic receptors and just sends signals like wild. Okay? And nicotine, of course, is an absolutely wildly unnatural compound that has zero reason to be in your body at any point in time ever, unless you use tobacco products, and then it will be in your body pretty constantly. Okay, what about muscarinic receptors? These are going to be receptors on every single effector in the parasympathetic branch. So everything that's innervated parasympathetically will have muscarinic receptors at the effector. And then also, just within the sympathetic branch, just the sweat glands, just the sudoriferous glands, only those will have muscarinic receptors. And muscarinic receptors, you're going to want to know, in opposition to cholinergic, which are always excitatory, they may be excitatory. In other words, we might be turning on this sweat gland and getting it to pump sweat out, or they might be inhibitory. And it's really up to what's going on at the effector and what effect you want. Okay. And they're also called muscarinic because it's a toxin in mushrooms, and that gets right in there again as an agonist, and it just lands perfectly in the muscarinic receptors, mimicking acetylcholine, and it just hammers those receptors and just sends signals and signals and signals. All right. Now, remember how we turn off innervation, we turn off stimulation. That neurotransmitter gets released across the cleft. It binds to either the nicotinic or the muscarinic receptors in the postsynaptic membrane. But then we got to get the acetylcholine out of there, right? What were the three ways? You remember, go back in sort of those sort of chapter 12, those videos on sort of the anatomy of the nervous system, and we sort of broke down the action potential, the transmission. So how do we get out of the synapse? How do we get the neurotransmitter out of the synaptic cleft? One, it diffuses away. I can draw these. So these little red molecules are the acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft, which is between this blue curved shield and these green receptors. One, it diffuses away. Two, it gets reuptake back into the axon, or sometimes up into the receptor cell. And three, an enzyme comes along, acetylcholine esterase, and acetylcholine esterase, I'll just abbreviate it ACHE, comes in and it breaks acetylcholine into, wait for it, acetate and choline. It's two component parts, right? That's really fast. Acetylcholine esterase is super fast. Gets in there, breaks them up. So cholinergic neurons, their effects are really short-lived because that acetylcholine esterase is able to go into the synaptic cleft and just whack that acetylcholine into two pieces, break it up, and get it out of there. So just keep in the back of your mind that cholinergic effects are very, very quickly lived. They don't last a long time. Okay, now let's move to adrenergic neurons, and you're going to only see those in this particular postsynaptic neuron in just the sympathetic. Well, most of the sympathetic arm works off of on the postganglionic side, right? So the unmyelinated postganglionic neuron that we're showing with the arrow, most of those are adrenergic, meaning they release norepinephrine or epinephrine at the effector. Okay, they're stimulated by acetylcholine and nicotinic receptors, but then as they move down on the postganglionic side to the actual effector, whether the effector be intramural or whether the effector be whatever it is, some sort of cardiac muscle, some kind of smooth muscle, some kind of gland, whatever it is, if it's in the sympathetic and it's not a sweat gland, it's going to be triggered by adrenergic neurons that secrete norepinephrine. Therefore, at the effector, we need to have adrenergic receptors, okay, to go along with the adrenergic neurons that are releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine. So we need to have adrenergic receptors at the effectors. Okay. And also, too, you're just going to want to just store this right here. Take this right now and just store it in the back of your head for later when we get to 40C in the endocrine system, that these receptors are really, really important. Because sure, they might be receiving norepinephrine and epinephrine across the synaptic cleft at this junction, but bear in mind, remember that path that we talked about in the sympathetic arm where we run to the chromaffin? The preganglionic neuron runs to the chromaffin cells sitting in the adrenal gland, sitting right on top of the kidney, and there's no postganglionic neuron there. It's the only one of that whole sympathetic, those 10 or 12 pathways we talked about. It's the only one where there's no postganglionic neuron. Why? Because when that preganglionic neuron smashes those chromaffin cells, they just blurt out adrenaline or epinephrine into the bloodstream, or noradrenaline or norepinephrine, and they just loose it into the bloodstream. And that is pure adrenaline coursing through your veins, as the old saying goes. And be aware that all these receptors that are adrenergic everywhere in the body can also pick up that epinephrine or that norepinephrine as it's being circulated through the body. So just bear that in the back of your mind, that this is just showing kind of a very reserved synaptic cleft, but these adrenergic receptors are important for picking up epinephrine or norepinephrine released through the bloodstream via endocrine pathways too. Okay? That's probably enough of that. And yeah, just on the effectors, so the adrenergic receptors are found just in the effectors, the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and most of the glands of the sympathetic arm, but not the sweat glands. So you won't find them in the sweat glands, but you'll find them everywhere else. Okay, and there are two types of adrenergic too. So this should say, yeah, this is, sorry, this doesn't even need to be there at all. Two types of, this is from the previous slide, sorry about that. This was going into the nicotinic and the adrenergic and the muscarinic. We've changed topics. We're on adrenergic neurons now. And the adrenergic neurons also have two types, alpha and beta receptors. And I won't hold you to being too specific about alpha and beta receptors, but those are just the two different types, and they have different effects. Typically, alpha 1, beta 1 tend to be stimulatory. Alpha 2, beta 2 tend to be inhibitory, but a little bit more detail than we need. Just know in the back of your mind, think, okay, there's alpha receptors and there's beta receptors when we start talking about adrenergic. We're not going to go into it in as much detail as we did the difference between muscarinic and nicotinic when we're talking about cholinergic. Okay. And then again, you got to get that norepinephrine or that epinephrine out of the synaptic cleft. Here it is, right here, the norepinephrine. It can diffuse away. It can be reuptaken back into the axon or into the effector cell, or an enzyme can come along and it can degrade it. And all these processes, there is enzymatic degradation, there is retake up, but in terms of noradrenaline or adrenaline or norepinephrine and epinephrine, it's slower. It's much slower. The removal of these adrenergic compounds from the synapse is a little bit slower. So just bear in mind that adrenergic responses of the ANS are a little bit longer lived than cholinergic. Okay? Just something to keep in the back of your mind. And then lastly, just agonist and antagonist. An agonist goes in like a mimic, and it's an imposter, but it's a chemical that can trigger a receptor and trigger a response without being the intended chemical that is evolved to be in that receptor. It's just something that fits really, really well in there, and it can mimic the effect. And or An antagonist is a blocker that goes in and just completely blocks the receptor, so neither the agonist, none of the agonists or any of the mimics can get in there at all. Okay, so let's start with you on the antagonist, the blocking side. Botulism toxin, Botox. It's a nicotinic cholinergic inhibitor. It gets right into that receptor, and it just into the nicotinic receptor, and it just blocks the acetylcholine binding site, so acetylcholine cannot get in. And it is the single most toxic substance ever developed by the human race or ever known. Okay, botulism toxin. Why you inject it in your body is a little bit of a mystery to me, but you're shutting down wherever you put it in. You are shutting down all muscular movement absolutely whatsoever, because the acetylcholine can't get into the receptor and can't turn on the receptor. So, and that's a big deal when you want to get rid of your wrinkles and the muscles that make frown lines and wrinkles. You inject Botox in there so they can no longer contract, so you can't scrunch your face with muscular contraction, so you can't get wrinkles, and that's what Botox does. Okay, on the agonist side, phenylephrine. If you go into adrenergic alpha receptors, then phenylephrine can go right in there, and it can absolutely mimic the effect of norepinephrine or epinephrine with those adrenergic alpha receptors. And what do those, so if it goes into a receptor in the nasal epithelium, okay, what's going to happen during sympathetic innervation in your nasal epithelium is you're just going to constrict all the blood vessels, and you're going to shut off flow of nasal blood and mucus in your nasal epithelium. You don't need to produce, the last thing you want when you're running away from a bear is to have a runny nose, right? So you shut that down. If you shut down and you constrict the blood vessels, less blood flows through your nasal epithelium, less mucus and fluid leaks out of the nasal epithelium, less congestion, runny nose, all that, less fluid in your nasal epithelium. And so somebody came along and said, okay, well, if that happens during the sympathetic nervous system, why don't we make an agonist and call it a cold and flu medicine? Because when you take phenylephrine, it's going to go in there and it is going to constrict the blood vessels around your nasal epithelium. Therefore, less fluid leaked out, and you've got hopefully a reduction in the amount of fluid. I mean, right there, runny nose, right? Runny nose and congestion. I don't know if it says runny nose on there, but obviously that's a big deal. Okay, so that's how an agonist would work in this situation. Any rate, let's just finish this off, right? We're going to just walk through, and we're going to just try to be a little bit careful about how we characterize these receptors, right? So A, always excitatory, always depolarizing, always stimulating. That's obviously nicotinic. They're always that way. Sometimes depolarizing, excitatory, and sometimes hyperpolarizing, depending on the effector and what's going on. That would be, of course, muscarinic and adrenergic, or both. They could be both, right? Found in all postganglionic neurons of the ANS and the NMJ. That is nicotinic, absolutely, right? So that's in the postganglionic neuron, but not the effector. That's in the cell bodies and the dendrites of the postganglionic neuron, and that's that that first step of acetylcholine always hitting a nicotinic receptor and always sending the message down the line to the effector. Some kind of message is always going to the effector. At the effector, it might be stimulatory or it might be inhibitory, but it's always getting there via the nicotinic receptors in the postganglionic neurons. Okay? Found in most effectors of the sympathetic division of the ANS, and that's going to be adrenergic. Most of them are adrenergic, unless it's the sweat gland. And if it's the sweat gland, it's going to be have muscarinic, right? So just get your head around that little subtlety right there. All right, and F, found in all effectors of the parasympathetic, that's all muscarinic, right? So every effector in the parasympathetic that's innervated parasympathetically is going to show muscarinic receptors. All right, binding norepinephrine is going to be adrenergic, of course. Binding acetylcholine will be muscarinic and nicotinic. They both bind acetylcholine. And then binding epinephrine is, of course, going to be adrenergic. All right, short, sweet, to the point. I hope that helped you out a lot, and thanks for sticking with it. And we'll move on now to quite a bit of the chapter 16, and we'll start to move on to sensory pathways, ascending sensory pathways, and motor pathways, and sensation. All right, thank you very much.